Owen, you're very welcome to the ScaleX Insider podcast. Really thrilled to be speaking with you today.
Well, brilliant to be with you. I really appreciate the invitation.
You're very welcome. We talked a little bit off air about our own vision to inspire, connect, and enable millions of ambitious leaders of SMEs, small and medium-sized businesses, to scale with purpose. So I always pose this question to all of our guests. Owen, what does scaling with purpose mean to you?
For me, what it means, and it's the motivation behind writing Belonging, is that in these so-called high-performing environments, which I've been privileged to be part of, there are some really progressive, research-based, beautiful actions that happen around the team culture and the way it's led. And what I was never comfortable with, having come from quite a humble background, was that only people with some elite talent should get exposed to such progressive ideas around their work environment and how they're developed. And so scaling up with purpose for me means these ideas, which these so-called elite teams operate under, should be scaled out and shared with the whole world, so that my siblings who have manual jobs in New Zealand, or anyone, should be actually have a transformative experience around, the way they're treated at work. That's really what motivates me.
Brilliant. There's a couple of things you've mentioned there, and we're going to come to it as we get into the podcast and certainly unpack your wonderful book. The first is the bringing the elite performance components to the masses. What started you on this journey? How did you get into this?
I tell you, that's actually a very hard question to answer. I grew up in New Zealand, in the South Island of New Zealand. I actually wanted to be a farmer. That was my first ambition. But as a teenager, I started to really understand how hard work that really was. And that became a slight disincentive to throw myself completely into it. So decided to go with my mates to university. I wanted to be a PE teacher. However, I didn't enjoy biology. I do now, but I didn't at the time, and that was a disincentive for that. So I ended up doing law. And actually, as I studied law, I actually fell in love with the subject. And also the purpose behind that, although people might be skeptical, I think myself and a lot of lawyers are very purpose-driven. They want to make sure that people's rights are respected and that things are done fairly and treated fairly, people treated fairly. So that was a big motivation for me. So I became a lawyer. I then did my overseas experience in London and stayed, married an English girl, and became a partner in a city law firm. I got into performance coaching very accidentally. Basically, the CEO of Saatchi & Saatchi globally was a New Zealander at the time. They were doing a big project with Adidas, and he cobbled together a few New Zealanders to try and give a New Zealand point of view on some of the questions Adidas were raising. And part of it was about emotional connection. So I'm part Maori, the Indigenous people of New Zealand, and part of my contribution was to explain some Maori spiritual ideas, which sit behind the All Blacks team culture, but also, broadly across Polynesia. And Adidas really enjoyed that, really connected with those ideas. And suddenly they, or people around them, started to think that I did this for a full-time job, talking about these things, which was completely incorrect. But I came back to my legal desk, and at Chelsea Football Club, contacted me and asked me if I would come in for a conversation, and in the South African cricket team, and it just led on from that. So I'm not prepared for this career, haven't studied anything sensibly about it, but I think the fact I've come from a slightly left field position has helped me, and I think that's probably what attracts the teams I work with, is that they want to get away from some of the convention and management speak and try and cut to the chase a little bit about some new ideas, fresh energy.
And look, those new ideas and fresh energy is it's palpable in your wonderful book, Belonging. You speak with a huge amount of authenticity. I know you have, having read the book, Irish heritage, and I had a sense of belonging envy whenever I read this book. It's so rich with your heritage. It's such a compelling read, and has so much. There's so much authenticity, as I mentioned, in your voice. So look, let's get into that, and it leads on nicely from how you've kind of accidentally, but I'm delighted that you have found a career in performance coaching and sharing with us the importance of belonging. Why did you write the book, and what have you set out to achieve by writing the book?
Well, I come back to my earlier comment that I feel quite privileged to have been in quite a diverse range of environments. I mean, obviously in sport, but also leadership teams in business. I've worked with the Command Group of NATO, the 3 4-star generals who run NATO. I've worked professional ballet, worked in a lot of different environments, and there are some common threads as to how they get the best out of their people. And I wanted to share those ideas widely. So, it wasn't a kiss and tell story, that's for sure. I talked to everybody who's in the book. I asked them if I could share. Everybody agreed. As you can see, the people I work with, I interviewed Gareth Southgate, from the Sir Richard Sharef, the British 4-star general, some world-class ballet dancers. So everybody was happy to do that. So that was really the mission of the book, is to try and share some of these ideas. Because at the moment, I feel, we talked about the word scaling. I think belonging also is a word which is pretty ubiquitous, but actually when you drill into it, a lot of people don't fully understand what it means, and certainly don't feel confident in how to create a culture which is anchored in belonging. So the time, after the 2 years we've experienced of disconnection and anxiety and isolation, I think people are very keen to reset around belonging and around connection. But the academic bit and the research is one part of it, but we need some practical ideas as to how we actually do it. So for me, that was where an opportunity rested to share.
Brilliant. And you mentioned your Maori background, and you bring that out in the book. There's a term spelled WHAKPAPA, whakapapa, that you introduce right at the start of the book. Can you share with the listeners what that term means, and the importance of that term, and the relevance in the context of scaling businesses?
Okay, well, beautifully pronounced, whakapapa. I'll explain it, but also would like everyone to understand that this is a universal idea. It originated, this particular form of it, in Polynesia and the Maori people. But actually, I've worked all around the world, and I've had people from all corners of the world say that that's an idea that they understand and connect to. The background of it was, my father was part Maori and part English. My mother was completely Irish on her side. But my father passed away when I was 5, and he was part English and part Maori. And he was an only child, and his father had also passed, and his mother lived 1,000 miles away. So I wasn't surrounded, after he passed, I wasn't surrounded by either the English or Maori parts of my culture. And I had an emotional problem with that. I think my siblings less so. I think they were able to create their own identity stories. But for me, being part of these big tribes was a big part of my identity. And I felt very frustrated that I didn't feel a sense of belonging to them. So when I was 12, I wrote to the Maori tribe, and I just basically said, this is who I am. This is who my father was. This is my grandmother. Do you know who I am? And they wrote a very beautiful letter back, which I talk about in the book, saying, we know who you are and you belong here. And then they set out, 25 generations of my ancestors, and some beautiful stories about the type of people they were and the type of people we are. But they also introduced this idea of whakapapa. And that idea is that each of us, and this is obviously, as I mentioned, a universal idea, each of us are part of an unbreakable chain of people. Whatever community you want to think about, whether it's your family, whether it's your nation, whether it's your school, whether it's a team, organization, whatever community you feel connected to, the way they frame it is that you're part of an unbreakable chain of people with their arms interlocked, all the way back to whatever the origin story might be. but also into the future to the end of time. And the metaphor is that the sun first shone on our origin story and our very first ancestors, but the sun slowly moves down this line of people. So for me, being, you know, an Eastwood or a New Zealander or whatever I am, whatever community it is, I've always been in this line of people. And so there's a sense of immortality about it. The only thing that happens is that your time in the sun will be revealed in due course. And that's how we understand our place in the world and our place in connection with other people. So just by that idea of having these unbreakable bonds with the people before you and after you, just gives you an incredible, profound sense of belonging in itself. But how I also use it in my work is that strong cultures are ones where not only is the sun moving down the line of people, but along with that, this articulation of who we are, our identity story, and our values, the things that we really believe in and we place value on, even rituals and traditions in certain teams, but also a vision of what success would ultimately look like beyond, you know, financial metrics or any other scoreboard. All of these things get passed down, but when the sun's shining on each generation, they have an obligation to renew it. So you inherit these things, but you don't just mimic them. You have to work out in the context you face, what is it that we need to contribute and what is the chapter that we need to write. And, you know, I've done that in a wide range of teams. You know, England football team's an example where that was never really done. But before we go into these World Cups and European Championships, etc., we actually reflect back on the story up to this point. We connect with our ancestors and the type of people they were and their values. But then we decide what is the chapter we want to write for ourselves. And, you know, that preview becomes our vision. We preview what we want to do together because we know it's only for a moment in time and the sun will pass and others will replace us. So it's very practical and spiritual at exactly the same time, isn't it?
There is just so much in this that I want to unpack. You've mentioned, you know, almost when you talk about the sun shining on you and then it will move down generations. I coach quite a number of second generation leaders, and something that they really struggle with is how they care for daddy's dream. And it typically is daddy who founded the company. And they're almost conflicted with wanting to pursue their dream, but being very respectful and maintaining the integrity of the dream from the founder. How have you found, or how do you coach around that? I have this situation at the moment where one young CEO is just about to be handed the baton from his father and is a very strong founder, and he wants to put his own stamp in the business. What should second generation leaders retain and what should they make their own?
Well, I've had the privilege of working with some startups and also some second generations. And I feel it's a really exciting area. First thing is, although you frame that question a certain way, the first thing I would always do is just appreciate the energy of the founders. You know, to have created something, and then for it to have become sustainable, profitable, and then to have an impact in their community. I mean, that is to be celebrated. So there's something very special about the energy of that startup first generation origin story that we want to have as renewable energy for us. We want to continue to tap into it. Because there's actually a very famous Israeli economist, Itzhak Adizes, who did an incredible study which shows that actually, I think it's something like 90% of startups ultimately a few generations on fail, because what happens is that original energy of the startup is replaced by bureaucracy, is replaced by structure. And what really happens is the energy and the soul of what we started with gets lost. So I suppose what I'm saying is we can overcorrect. We could have, we can have a startup which is in some ways a cult of personality, and obviously there's a risks in that. But we don't want to go too far the other way where we take all that away and end up with great processes and everything, and then we feel like we don't have our own identity anymore and we've lost our soul. And I have been called in over the last 12 months on many different projects where people are saying that is exactly where we're at. And as I said, Adizes has done some very robust research that that's actually a natural cycle of startups, unless you have intention to maintain that spirit and soul and energy. So to answer your question, the second generation, if I was coaching them, what I would be doing is, okay, we've got a big personality, and no doubt a lot of what was done was mirrored, of their personality. But what we really need to do is looking at, as a business, what can we extract from the story so far in terms of some fundamental beliefs or some traits. So let's try and sort of objectify it a little bit. So if we've had amazing energy, then that potentially is a trait which can become a value. If we actually had incredible adversity, which we overcome, and there's some powerful stories around that, then rather than saying that was what a great leader we had, we can actually say we've actually are resilient. Our identity has a resilience to it, and these are the stories. So that's what I would do, but also with sports teams, the same thing. Because it's not about the cult of personality, it's about what does this all add up to as a team, as an organization, and then let's capture those. So let's not do values like excellence and professional integrity. I look hard at the actual traits that we've exhibited to get this far, because they are the things that we can take forward, albeit they need to be refreshed and possibly redefined to meet our own challenge. So I'm looking for us to have a continuity. That's the key thing. Yeah. I don't want to break from that, but at the same time, it's got to be fit for purpose of what we want to achieve. And that has to be more than just a personality and a subjectivity.
And something I haven't heard it put this way before, and I love this. You refer to it and write about it in chapter 2. You open up the chapter. If you own your memory, you can own your future. And the chapter's about our us story. Share with the listeners just the backdrop to the us story and why the us story is important when we're forming culture.
Well, there's a lot of research which is, put in the book, but it's sort of, it's one of those things where it's quite self-evident, isn't it? We have a hormonal response to hearing the story of us. If I go down, when I go home this evening, if I get my kids and sit them down and say, hey, I'm going to tell you a story about your grandma or your grandpa, they'll listen, they'll lean into it. And when I tell them this story, they will have an emotional reaction to it. And that's what we're like. And all these things are measured from a biological point of view, is that when you hear the story of Ireland, Northern Ireland, where you hear the story of your favorite sports team, where you actually just see a flag, which is a symbol of your us story, it's not even the us story, you will have a spike in your dopamine and oxytocin levels. That is pure energy from a performance point of view. And the teams that I work with, there's a lot of stress in the system anyway, just through the nature of competing and scrutiny. So what we're looking for is not to have people sort of marinating in cortisol and adrenaline. What we're trying to do is shift the hormonal soup so that it's a more positive energy, if you wish. And that leads to a completely different set of behaviors in people who are completely in an anxiety state. So whenever we tell the story of us, it just creates completely fresh and renewable energy. And it is a complete lost opportunity when you have not only organizations, I would argue nations, where there's a failure to explain, this is who we are, this is our story, this is what we believe in, and this is what we actually want to achieve in the future. And, in sports contexts, I've said a lot, it's too much technical. But also in corporate environments, I was in a law firm for a very long time and I really enjoyed it. But I don't think we ever once talked about our story of who we were. And I actually found out about the founding partners after I'd left. And it was an incredible story. It was completely a wasted source of energy when I was there. Everything was around, these are what we're trying to do strategically, and these are the financial scoreboard that we're trying to achieve. So, that's fine. But if we actually connect with our us story, and there's some beautiful research, which, you'll recall around at nighttime, when human beings tell stories at night, they're fundamentally different than stories in the day. Nighttime stories are all around our connection, our togetherness. social bonding, while the stories we tell in the daylight are much more practical and tactical. So we're absolutely wired for these, and it's a real missed opportunity if our leaders aren't articulating it. But it's not just a history lecture, it's also putting what we're doing now in context. So if we're doing some important merger, acquisition, or project, or litigate, whatever it is, you know, these things should be noted and put into a story of this is who we are and this is what we're doing right now and this is why.
I love that, and I love the way you connect which is obvious to you, of course, but when you're reading this, you go, yeah, of course, how you extract or encourage people companies to extract their values from their us story. So you mentioned resilience, for example, maybe resilience that existed within the founder that they had to overcome, and certainly they will have had to overcome adversity if the company has now lasted into a second generation, undoubtedly. And it's connecting the us story to the values that are now up on the wall, and then in turn extracting the behaviors or defining the behaviors you want to see aligned to those values, which have their origins in the us story. Where have you seen this? And you give a number of examples, but if you can share with the leaders, where have you seen the real potency of connecting the behaviors that you want to see now in the business back to the us story?
Well, I don't, in my own work, I don't talk about values, I talk about anchors, because these are the beliefs that anchor us and our identity story. And I, as you recall, I actually give a very historic example from my own culture that, you know, the Polynesians were epic voyagers. You know, the Pacific Ocean is 25% of the Earth's surface, and without any maps, any navigation tools, any written language, they explored that whole area. And this is 1,000 years ago. And to the north, they discovered Hawaii, to south, New Zealand. East, they went all the way to South America, but they all came back to this tiny island of 60 square miles, Raratea, which is now in French Polynesia. And one of the things that they did is the navigator, when they went on these epic voyages, would bring 3 stones and put the 3 stones in the vessel, and all the crew would come around them. And these 3 stones, these 3 anchors, if you like, represented who they were. So, you know, one of them would be, just as an example, resilience, to use that as an example, would be a stone that had been shot out of a volcano thousands of years before. So jagged and darkened and burnt and black, but they've been sitting on the beach for hundreds of years, thousands of years. So that would sit there, and that's who we are as people. We're resilient. So that's an anchor. And then, you know, there'll be another one from the meeting house, which would represent our togetherness, and another one made of greenstone, which would represent adaptability, because you can make jewels from it, but also weapons from it, fish hooks, whatever's required. So that, to me, I still don't know of a better explanation of how you practically use values than what they did 1,000 years ago. They would have 3 anchors, these 3 stones, and if they were facing these massive storms or running out of food, whatever, in order to work out how to get through the situation, they would come around those stones and reconnect with them. Now, I took that quite literally into some of the teams I work with. So one of the teams is a South African cricket team I work with. And one of our anchors was honesty. And the reason we had that is just simply because of the complex political context of the country, and that's the most diverse team in world sport. People really struggle to have honest conversations with each other. They're very scared of offending somebody. They're challenging, because, you know, you'd read things into it that you and I might not read into our interaction. So we had to actually get rid of that, because we couldn't have a high-performing environment if we couldn't have these honest conversations. So we had to. So one of the anchors, one of these stones. So we literally had a stone, which was our honesty stone, and we would literally hand it around the team and get everybody just to speak to, what does honesty mean to you? So you would have a player like Hashim Amla, a Muslim, who would say, honesty is defined for me in the scriptures of the prophet. And he would explain to this, and this is what I also think inclusion sort of looks like. He'd explain what that word meant to him. So he would commit to, you know, I'm going to live this trait in this environment, but you need to understand where I'm coming from with it. And then the next person who would hold the stone was a born-again Christian. And he'd actually come from an environment where his parents were divorced and not honest with their children. He'd also inherited some of that dishonesty in his relationships. So he would explain that honesty means something very different to me, but he told his story of what it meant and his commitment to live an honest life, because he'd lived a dishonest one and how that scarred him. So everybody has an opportunity to hold the stone and define what that value means for them. But the important thing is that's the most diverse team in world sport, and they all had their beautiful uniqueness, but everyone bought into, these are the anchors of this team. So when I'm in here, this is what we must live. And there were 3 of them as well. So, that's a very direct answer to your question. That's what it can look like. And I again, it's just practical, isn't it? It's practical. It's not something that sits on a wall or whatever.
The hairs are standing up at the back of my neck as you say that, because, and I haven't heard values termed as anchors before, but it makes complete sense as you were describing the boats, these hundreds of thousands of years ago, and hitting a storm, and when the passengers, the crew, were struggling to know where to go, what path to navigate, they go back to the anchors to guide them. And I always said values should direct behaviors if there's no one watching. So staff member gets a difficult call from a customer late on a Friday evening. They want to go home, they want to finish up their week. It's a challenging call, they've nobody to speak to. What is their anchor in that moment to guide the decision that they must make? And if the values direct and inform that decision, then on Monday, irrespective of the ramifications of the decision, as long as it's rooted in the, as you term, the anchors or the values, then the decision is the right decision. So I love that.
Yeah. No, beautiful. And from a performance point of view, because that's my day job as a performance coach, we integrate our values into the way that we preview and we review our performance. So for example, with England football team, we've also got 3 anchors, and before we will play a game, we will preview, if we live those anchors, what would it look like against that opposition in that stadium, in that context. We preview it, and then after the game, as well as reviewing all the technical, tactical and individual stuff, we will also review, did we actually live our anchors in this game? And when I think back as being a lawyer, we would go through some very, very tricky cases. I was a litigation lawyer, but we never ever once integrated our values as a firm into the work we were doing. So there was, for example, there would be ethical issues, there would be tough negotiation issues, there would be just tactical calls you needed to make. And it was all done in a bit of a vacuum. We weren't anchored by anything. Whilst if I was coaching a law firm now, I'd have a very different approach, is that, whatever our anchors are, we need to bring them into how we're performing. And when we make these big decisions, we need to use them as part of the filter to get to the answer, rather than something completely irrelevant which sits on a wall or sits in a policy somewhere.
And would you have felt, Owen, if you had those anchors, that number one, you would have consumed a lot less energy in trying to think of what the right approach would be to this challenging decision? And would they have given you a level of comfort in terms of the decisions that you ultimately made?
I think so, because what actually happens a lot in the corporate world, and certainly happened in a law firm, is that in the absence of values that we share and we really buy into, is that basically a leader will make subjective judgments of their own. So, again, going back to a litigation example, whether we settle or not, whether we go to court or not, whether we bring in this witness or not, whether we take a more aggressive approach, none of that was being filtered through our identity as a firm and as a team. It was done really very much subjectively to what a particular partner with their personality subjectively decided was the thing to do. Now, there was no, therefore you just get inconsistent behaviors throughout a firm, because if that person wasn't there and someone else was, then it would be a completely different approach because they had a different personality. I mean, that is not cohesion. And that is not how you get the best team performance. So yeah, again, this shouldn't be abstract. This is very practical stuff. Like, how do we perform as a team and share an identity together?
Continuing on the theme of practicality in terms of moving from a Russ story to how I behave, on the factory floor in line with the values, because there's often a lot of eye rolling from people when we talk about values. I was interviewing Alan Wilson a number of weeks ago, and he talked about, values are for living, not laminating. And often in a corporate environment, we feel quick, we need to get values together. The board members go away, they chat about these for an hour and come out and send a corporate email around these are our values. Where have you seen, or can you call out exemplars of businesses who have really embedded the values as witnessed by the behaviors of the people within the business, and how practically have they done that?
Well, I think there's two really critical elements. One is the language has to be owned and consistently used by particularly the leaders in the first instance. Someone once said that culture is language, and there's a lot of truth to that. There's no point saying we've got these 3 values or 5 values, whatever they are, and you never hear the language. In the last year, I've done 2 corporate coaching engagements, and it's been very interesting. And both of them, after having spoken one-on-one interviews with multiple people, not one person has mentioned the values once. Okay, so that is rich data to really evaluate how impactful they are. But it needs to be from the top down. Is that this is words we use and we integrate into our normal conversation. Okay, so that's a real challenge. It's not a hard thing to do, but it needs a lot of intention. So that's a big part of it. Another key part of integrating these values is they need to be wrapped in stories. And in belonging, I give you an example, don't I? I'm coming back to that word resilience, but when I was 12 years old and my tribe sent to me, my whakapapa and these stories, they interestingly identified my grandmother 5 generations ago, a woman called Pakanui. And they gave me 2 pages of her life story. And, she was born in the 1820s. When Maori didn't even have a written language. So it's quite awesome, actually, that they have subsequently articulated her life. But, she faced incredible adversity. Her village was massacred by another tribe when she was 8. I think 600 people were killed one morning. She was escaped as an 8-year-old with some of the older people through the back of the village, across these swamps into the woods. When she was, I think, 12, there was smallpox and influenza came in from Europeans and wiped out 1/3 of the whole Maori population. She survived that. When she was 15, she was raped by a European whaler. When she was 16, the same thing happened. And having children, 2 boys to these from these incidents. When she was, I think, 18 or 19, the British colonial government just took their land away again and gave it to white settlers. So she had, she was baptized when she was 19 and told never ever to talk Maori again and not to believe in any of the stories that had been passed down to her. That there was only thing to believe in was the Bible. But she was this charismatic, positive matriarch of our family. But the reason the tribe told me all those stories was to reaffirm that notwithstanding whatever we face, we are very, very resilient people. And I've passed that story on to my own daughter. So we use our stories and our ancestors to give this value some meaning. So the other thing, the 2 top line things, one is you got to incorporate consistently these words into your language. And secondly, they need to be wrapped in stories, not only of the past, but also of today. If literally today someone does stay late and deal with the customer and resolve it and make a personal sacrifice for that, if that's reflective of one of our anchors, one of our values, then the next day that story should be shared with everybody to reaffirm this is who we are, and this is how we do things.
Yeah, I love that. Something that we had within our previous business we do now is wins of the week, and And part of the wins of the week is actually calling out the behaviours which are aligned to the values which we've described. And, and again, similarly, I've seen, and can you share with us where you've seen the anchors being used to have a difficult conversation because you can be candid because the anchors are there?
Yeah, well, I gave an example of where the South African cricket team, honesty was one of their anchors, one of their values. Now, you can't just say, because we've got a value, everybody just go and live it. You actually have got to create the right ecosystem for it. Like for honesty, people aren't just going to do it because they're told it's a value. You need to create the right environment and culture for that. So what does that involve? Well, it involves a relational environment. I'm not going to be honest with anybody unless I have a relationship with them. Okay, why would I do that? Why would I expose myself, be vulnerable if I don't know the person and have some degree of trust? So we need managers and leaders who actually can create the conditions for people to be honest. Okay, so that's a really critical part of it. We also need to have it role modeled for us by the people we look up to. So don't just tell everybody we need to have honest conversations if we don't see it demonstrated by them. And the other, also with a value or anchor like honesty, we need some skills training about it. And I do a little bit of this in my work because guys in particular can be horrendous at this. It's certainly where I come from in the world, they are very scared of having emotional conversations. And if you're going to be very honest with someone and potentially challenge them, then that creates a lot of anxiety. So we need to teach a skill to go with the value. So we do that. I'm on the board of Harlequins. We had a good session a few months ago at the start of the season, just really some skills acquisition around how we can have honest conversations with each other. And, and there can be some simple things like everything we stand for represents a line. And everybody in this team has permission that if you see anything below the line, either work ethic or standards or integrity or whatever, then you call it out. Okay, so that's our identity of who we want to be. We want to be a team which lives with this high line of who we are, and we live above that line. And that's where the beautiful things happen, and that's where our potential lives. Because if we tolerate living below the line, we're going to be a compromised environment. We're going to live with compromised standards, and it's not going to bring the best out of anybody. So the way we turn that into a skill is that we give everyone permission. We actually practice it and role model it. That, my friend, I want to have a chat. Can we have a coffee? I want to sit down with you. Today at training, I could be completely wrong here, but I thought I saw something a little bit below the line. Just the way you spoke to that junior player. Now, I might have got that completely wrong because so by all means, let's just sit down and talk about it, and I'm doing this because this is who we are and this is what we believe in, right? Even though it's uncomfortable. So let's go sit down and have a conversation. So they have a conversation, they play it out, and it may have been below the line, in which case that's an honest conversation, which is going to improve us and get us back above the line. If it was misunderstood or whatever, then that's explained as well and we can move on. But what we do is we give everyone permission together in an open environment that you're allowed to do that. In fact, you've got a responsibility to do it. And so that's another important part of living these values is sometimes you've got to teach skills that go with them.
I absolutely love that. I haven't heard that before, above the line. And that's a question that we can ask of ourselves, daily, weekly, monthly. Where am I now? Am I genuinely living above the line in accordance with the values and the behaviours which we have espoused and articulated? Or am I below the line? And that's a wonderful insight on the environment you've referred to a number of times. And of course, it requires a huge amount of psychological safety and trust amongst the team or the tribe to actually call out whether somebody's operating below the line or not. How important do you feel environment is in relation to really amplifying and living out the anchors And what have you seen done to change an environment which has made a real impact?
Well, environment is absolutely everything. You know, the English Institute of Sport did a study a few years ago, which was a meta study of 1,000 studies. And they found that 70% of human behavior is determined by whatever environment you're in. So if you and I go into a high standards, high integrity environment tomorrow, you know, our best versions will appear. If you and I go into a real crappy, untrusting, low integrity environment, unfortunately, hopefully we'll be able to be reasonably true to ourselves, but it's going to drag us down. We're going to be compromised at the very least. I mean, we might even replicate those behaviors that we detest. That's just the way we are. And the reason for that is that we have a fundamental need for belonging. And so whatever sort of community or social group we find ourselves in, we've got this hardwired desire to fit in. So, you know, I notice it with my son, he's 14, you know, when he's with one peer group, they work hard, do their homework, pushing hard, which is fantastic. And he performs well in that. But if it's a different peer group where they are trying to be too cool, they don't want to be seen to be doing homework, they don't want to be seen to try too hard, all of that, unfortunately, that will have a profound effect on his own performance. So as a parent, you know, we probably all have a very heavy focus on the peer group our kids are in, and it has a fundamental impact on their behavior. So it's no different in any of these teams. So we really want to think carefully about our environment. We want to think very carefully about the people we put in leadership positions. They don't have to be charismatic, they don't have to be Churchillian, but what they do need to do is represent the values that we espouse. And sometimes you do that with people who say very little, and that's fine. So all of these things have a big impact on our environment, the stories we tell, you know, and our baby. There's no point saying, you know, okay, let's have a psychologically safe environment. It doesn't work like that. You've got to create the conditions for that. You've got to be relational. You've got to build trust with people. You've got to role model that if someone says something unconventional or controversial or challenging, that they don't get shot down. You've got to show that it's an inclusive place, that it's not just a place where there's a clique of people who prosper and everyone else is there to make up the numbers. You know, if you're not prepared to do those things, then you can forget about psychological safety and living values.
Something you referenced there, my mum used to say it to me, show me your company and I'll show you who you are.
Yep.
And that's very much a nod to the environment that you're operating within. She also said, walk a mile with somebody who limps and you'll start limping yourself. So, you know, I think it was Jim Rohn who said you become the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. So that, you know, choose very carefully. And I've seen the power of that within our own mastermind groups as part of our Scale X Accelerator program. The power of a group of diverse people who are all aligned to scale their organizations with purpose. And as part of scaling their organizations with purpose, they're starting with leading self first and recognizing that they must role model the behaviors that they want to see within the business. And it's really potent when you see these groups of people coming together. It's so, and what we're saying here is that the reverse is also the case. So something you've called out as well or referenced throughout the conversation is the importance of having a shared vision, and you reference it in the book. Can you just elaborate on that and tell the listeners a little bit more about the importance of having a shared vision once you've articulated and really defined what the anchors or values are?
Well, human beings are extremely visual creatures. The visual system is the largest part of our brain. We are profoundly affected by the images that come, both what we think we're seeing, but also what we imagine, and in fact what we dream. So there's a lot of amazing research around that. And human beings, when things are being explained, they create mental pictures of what actually it is. So it's all very well to have a fantastic strategy, but actually the real impact comes from being able to visualize or create mental pictures of what exactly it would look like if we execute it. And that's what people are hungry for. I think it's interesting, Harvard Business School did some research, wasn't it? I think I mentioned the book, where something like, I think 75% of employees feel they do not get enough mental pictures painted by leaders, versus 3% of leaders' time is spent on visioning. There's just a massive disconnect. And, you know, I can assure you, going back into our ancestral evolutionary story, our ancestors were outstanding, actually, at creating mental pictures of what we're trying to do. Admittedly, the world was probably much simpler. But that is one leadership muscle that has become very weakened over time, is that our leaders today, and if you look at politics, I think it's a classic example. You can go into an election where there's 20 policies are explained, none of which add up to any type of mental picture or vision that any of us can see. It's all, so there's a huge opportunity. And also, again, coming back to the hormonal energy piece, you know, we know that when you create, or when you paint pictures for people of a shared vision, it is very motivating. So they have a dopamine response to that. Also, when it's a shared vision of what we're going to do together, it also generates oxytocin, that hormone of connection. So this is an energy source. So it's both provides clarity about what we're going after. It creates alignment because we're all seeing the same mental pictures of what success would look like. And thirdly, it connects us, socially bonds us. And in the absence of all of those things, we're less clear, we're less aligned, and we're less motivated.
Again, I'm smiling because we've just come from a session with our team about crafting a vivid vision, and that vivid vision concept is actually rooted in a concept by a guy called Brian Scudamore, who coined, well, I'm not sure if he coined it, but the painted picture from a company called 1-800-JUMP quite a number of years ago. And Cameron Hurld, who I interviewed in this season as well, has written a book called Vivid Vision. And I would encourage the listeners to, once they've had an opportunity to listen to this episode, to go back and listen to that other episode, because it's this is all interlinked. It's a brilliant point. And just coupled with that, our third principle of our ScaleX framework is purpose and vision. You've alluded to purpose in a couple of instances throughout the conversation, Owen. How important is purpose? And conscious that there's a lot of talk around purpose at the moment, certainly in business circles, and I'm conscious in these conversations that people don't run out and quickly, you know, we need a purpose. This is what everybody's doing. You know, what's your understanding of purpose and how do we get that right?
Well, as a performance coach, I look at what is our authentic purpose. I mean, why do we exist? What's the point of having us here? And sometimes in teams, that is highly motivating. You know, the England football team I work with, you know, the purpose around unifying and inspiring the countries, we can use that. From a performance point of view, that's a massive asset. But there are other, you know, and certainly in business, there are other situations where the purpose is actually not, it's not actually from a cultural point of view that motivating. It might be that an individual basically wants to become a billionaire. That's the purpose of that's why they're doing it. Or, you know, something that doesn't enhance the planet or the community, shall we say. So, and that's fine. It's not a problem at all, but I'm not going to use purpose as a motivating, you know, framework for the team culture. Then I would revert more to around our identity and looking forward as to what we want to achieve together. So my first part of the answer is I'm not just blindly following purpose. I'm actually very tactical about whether our purpose is authentically, not some corporate BS, you know, some strapline, what it really is, why we really are here. And if we can use it, let's go for it. If we can't, then we won't. So that's my starting point. But assuming that our purpose has some strength to it, then all a vision is just asking the question, if that purpose was lived out, what would it look like? This is as simple as that. Purpose and vision are the same thing. Vision is just simply the mental pictures that go with our purpose. So, you know, again, a national sports team, if our purpose is to inspire and unify, let's just create a space to think about, well, what the hell does that actually look like? And it's more than just winning a trophy. especially the unifying bit of it, it's going to be something slightly different. What do people see when they see us? Are we a mirror for the best version of themselves or the best version of this country? With the South African cricket team, when we talked about our purpose, we really had this metaphor of we want to be a mirror for the country to look into, to see that we're diverse, but we are brothers and sisters, and we work together. Anyone can be a hero any day, provided you just live by these values. And we celebrate that, and everyone is equal. And this is a place which is inclusive and fair. That was motivating, but they would create real pictures around what that would look like.
Yeah.
So that they go together. I don't see how you can have a purpose if you don't have a vision of what it actually looks like if you live it.
And I didn't tee you up for that, but that's why we have them as one principle. Purpose and vision is their third principle. They go hand in hand. Something one of your neighbours, your Australian neighbours mentioned. I interviewed Gary Ridge, CEO and chairman of WD-40 recently, and he uses the terminology and actually wrote a book at the back of this of tribe instead of team, and it's something obviously you bring forth in the book. How important do you think is it to use that language?
It's an interesting one. I find tribe for me is a reasonably innocuous term, just from the part of the world I come from, but I actually find in Europe and in Great Britain, some people get very nervous around that language. I don't tend to use it too much in my work. What I'm interested in is sometimes we talk about teams. If we're talking about an organization of 1,000 people, is that really a team? Not really. Not my definition of a team. It's more of a community. So it all comes back to the same thing. We have a profound sense of belonging that we are looking for. The most potent version of that for most people is their family, and then their wider kin, but then the neighborhood, but then beyond that, the wider community, but then the tribe, but then the place, and that can build up to a nation. And then there's certain belief systems that we have, which also we feel a sense of community and belonging to. So, it goes out in concentric circles from there. So the ideas are the same, whether what terminology we use. But if we want to feel connected with other people who we share something with, then that is coming down to belonging.
In the interest of diversity and inclusion, just on the back of what you've just said, we all hold that profound sense of wanting to belong. Do you think we can hold on to our identities too strongly? At what point do we say, well, they're not quite the color for this team, the size for this team, the gender for this team? At what point does belonging, or how do we ensure that cultivating that sense of belonging actually doesn't act against wanting to create diverse teams?
Well, that's a really good question. So I think people get caught up in all this a little bit, but I've got a bit of a simplistic approach. So all I can do is share that. So whatever team organization I'm working with, we absolutely love and celebrate the diversity of everybody who's involved. And whether that's their personality, whether that's their background, whether that's their skin color, ethnicity, religion, whatever. We look around that circle and look at each other, and that is our strength, this diversity that we have, and we embrace it. So that's our starting point. But we also have a shared identity. Along with all this diverse, unique identities of individuals, we have a shared identity as a team or a community. And if you think about it, and actually this is not a metaphor, we literally do this. We would have all of our diverse team in a circle and have our three anchors in the middle. And we're celebrating our difference and our uniqueness and our diversity. But we are also explaining very simply that to be part of this team, these are the values that we all sign up to. But you get to write them in your own handwriting. You get to hold that anchor and explain what it means to you. But there is something that is binding us together, Otherwise, we're just a very unique, different, but random set of people thrown together. That's never ever going to be a high-performing team. We need to be a group of people who buy into something very central around our purpose, around our sense of who we are and how we do things, around the game plan and our roles. We're not going to be successful if we don't buy into those things. So I think sometimes people get a bit lost. They go maybe too far on the spectrum one way or the other. But to me, that's just what it is. It's not a political thing. It's just a practical thing. And I've not had an experience where that approach doesn't work well. But the leaders need to be able to stand there and articulate clearly what is it that is binding us. And maybe in this climate, some people are nervous about doing that. But if we're talking about traits like, resilience and honesty and being fearless and being agile and things like that, I don't think you're going to have a major problem getting everybody to sign up to those. But you need to do it in an inclusive way, where it's not just an Anglo-Saxon or one way of defining that word or behaviour. Just let them define it for themselves, and then we're good to go.
Brilliant. And before we get into the closing, there's a couple of questions just on the back of that. Given the remote environments that we're now working in, the hybrid environments, the Zoom environments, how do we really cultivate a strong sense of belonging in those environments?
To me, they're no impediment, actually. I've seen some cultures during the last couple of years strengthen online. They were, i.e. they're stronger online than they were in person. And the reason for that is actually because things to a degree slowed down and changed in terms of people having more exposure to the leaders, because we could all go on a Zoom call. They started to address some of these things in the normal busyness of working life they'd failed to previously around, actually, this is our story. We've never really celebrated or even talked about it, but actually this is our story, and have sessions on that. They've actually had sessions on, this is our vision of what we're trying to achieve. They've created a forum to re-articulate, freshen up the values attached with storytelling, and create a space for people to just think a bit differently about that and start hardwiring. So it's Zoom or Teams or working remotely is not an impediment if you utilize the time and space in a way which binds people together. And also, I've seen other great examples where leaders have had one-on-one conversations with people in a really quality way they wouldn't have had in the busy life previously. But I've also seen leaders, coaches contact and connect with families of their people, which they never would have thought about before, but they're able to do online. All of these things reinforce people's sense of belonging and connection. So it's an important mindset. I think a lot of people think, oh, okay, well, it can never be as good because it's online. I completely disagree with that. Some people are physically in the workplace all day, every day, and feel a profound sense of not belonging and a profound sense of feeling excluded. So that is not the answer, just to be together. Sure, when we're together, we have a different energy and we can have a different sort of hormonal experience if we do it well. So that's an opportunity, sure. But we can still absolutely have a strong culture remotely.
In closing, before we get into the timeless takeaways, you introduce a word in the book. It's an African word, Ubuntu. And I heard this word a number of years ago. Can you share with the listeners the backdrop and the importance of the word Ubuntu?
Yeah, well, this is all about purpose. So the South African cricket team, when I first got involved in 2010, they couldn't articulate their purpose. It never had been a discussion. They're too busy, working hard. So we created a space to do that. We did it in a pretty amazing way. We had some incredible guests who came and joined us for a few days in the bush, including Ahmed Kathrada, who was Nelson Mandela's cellmate for 10 years. And they told us about the Robben Island experience, etc. But the word that came through was this African idea of Ubuntu, which is simply defined as the measure of your life is your impact on others. Simple as that. So the team adopted that as their purpose, is that the measure of our life, the measure of this team is our impact on other people. And that was obviously competing and being successful on the field, but it was more than that. It was showing this mirror idea of a diverse but unified team of belonging and inclusion for everybody, and everyone had an opportunity to be their best versions in that team, and sticking together when times are tough and those type of things. So the idea of Ubuntu it's a very authentic indigenous way for that team to define its purpose and use that as a guiding light for the next 10 years when, you know, they had a huge amount of success.
Yeah, and it's something we always say to our leaders, you know, be the star maker, not the star. And I think Ubuntu captures that, you know, seeking to contribute. And I think that's where purpose, people can get caught up in purpose, and, you know, purpose with a small p is really about your contribution at a very micro level on a daily basis to someone else's life. How am I going to make and enrich somebody else's life today, whether that be your kids, your partner, your team member, and then leading into the organization. So, and then comes back, of course, leans back on the values and behaviors you want to see. So I love that.
Just a footnote on that, actually, that story, because I think it's important, because we can think of purpose as this big abstract thing that sits in the clouds. You know, I worked with them off and on for a 10-year period, up to 2019. The last camp I attended was in Port Elizabeth in 2019. And this is 10 years after the purpose or the idea of Ubuntu was introduced. And what was, you know, extremely satisfying for someone like me who had been part of that whole journey was that after training one day, the day before an international game, the leaders got everybody on the team bus. So we all jumped on the bus, and they took us to the local train station in Port Elizabeth, because at 6 o'clock every single day, there's these 3 incredible volunteers who feed homeless people. There's really good, nourishing food, and they bring it in the back of a ute, and they open it up, and be about 100 homeless people would just queue up. Now, this is where purpose is actually lived. It's not just a strap line. We all turned up there. No one knew in advance, just the leaders of it, of the team. So the whole team turned up. These superstars, absolute superstars in South African sport. And each of the players plated the food for a homeless person and sat with them while they ate and just chatted to them. And we were there for like an hour just sitting with them. And no media, nothing. No social, nothing. No one ever knew anything about it. That is a team that is genuinely living its purpose. Their Ubuntu, the measure of our lives is our impact on others. And that was one expression of it, not just winning World Cups.
Absolutely love that. Reminds me, yesterday I had a lesson in empathy from my wonderful business partner, Claire. She came into the meeting. We were meeting the team in a hotel yesterday morning, and she walked in, and with her warm smile, as she always does, she engaged with the team, and she said, before we start, I'd like to do something. She said, I've just walked past a homeless person this morning, and as I was coming into the hotel, they were alongside the building in a doorway. And she said, would you mind coming with me? We get some breakfast for the person. I said, yeah, of course, I'd be delighted to. So we went to a local cafe, and I walked in, and I walked to the sandwich rack, and I was about to lift a sandwich, and she said to me, that might be a little bit hard on their teeth. I suspect that their teeth won't be that strong. And I would never have thought of that. I would never, ever have thought to think in that way. And I have to say, in that act and coming back and giving, and it was a small act, but a meaningful one for that person that day, you feel so much better in doing that. And there's a theme that comes through from all of the leaders and experts that I interview, in that, you know, in giving we receive, and ultimately, you know, those successful organizations, those elite teams, those high performers all think about how they can serve others before they serve themselves. So, Owen, it's been a real a real privilege to spend the last hour and a quarter with you. I'm certainly enriched as a result of the conversation. Before we close, I always ask our guests or invite our guests to share with our listeners who are entrepreneurs, who are founders, who are leaders of businesses, who have aspirations to scale with purpose. Can you share with them 3 timeless takeaways?
I think the first one is to carve out space to reflect on what are your own core beliefs. Do that exercise first. What are the things you really believe in and want to be guided by? And then take that exercise to the team and to the business and just check. And it may be that you need to renew and change some of the espoused corporate values. And actually, you just gave a beautiful example of kindness. If you think about your own compass, and then you think about your colleagues and the way they work and what it looks and feels like when we're doing a really good job, just from that story you just shared, kindness might be actually a value. And you also demonstrated that kindness actually just leads to opportunity, and we know that. It's not a selfish motivation, but it does. When you have a kind act, it'll pay itself back. So, take out time from all the busyness and, stop reading my book and other books and just reflect on, what are the core beliefs, the anchors that you want to guide yourself to be the best version of yourself, but then do the same exercise for the team or organization you're running. Secondly, there are no shortcuts or hacks to this. If you want to create the type of environment where people thrive in, it has to be relational. And the only way you can do that is by having a personal relationship with the people that you're responsible for. There is no shortcut to that. Anything else is BS. So you need to get to know them. You need to understand their story. You need to give them the space to share that story. You need to be able to check in on them, how they're doing. And you need to have a relationship which is more than just their output and their performance. Okay, you don't have to be a coach in that deeply, but there needs to be some relationship, which is going to be the bank account of trust. And that will take you into very, very special places. And then, thirdly, it's just worthwhile previewing your own legacy. And, the sun will shine on all of us, which is a beautiful thing, but it won't shine on us forever. So when we're part of this business, whether it's a startup or an established business, or whether it's a community team, whatever, we are going to have an impact just by the fact that we're involved. And rather than sort of letting things drift or being passive, why don't we turn it around and say, what actually, when we're 70 or 80 years old and we look back on that moment in time when we had the sun shining on us, what was the legacy that we left? What impact did we make, and what conditions did we create for those who came after us? And, I actually did that exercise with the 4-star generals who run NATO. Got them to preview Afghanistan, Iraq, all the incredible amount they're responsible for. But we actually did that. We got them to think about, when this is all done and dusted, what will be the legacy of this leadership team? And it was quite a profound exercise. They articulated it and then put it on their desks, and they looked at it every single day. And, so I think it's a very worthwhile exercise to do, is just preview your own legacy. And if you feel comfortable, you share it with the team. If you want to keep it private, then that's fine as well.
Wow. Owen, those are really, really profound. I'm going to reflect after this on, certainly, and it's something that I do, but reflect again on my own anchors. I suspect there'll be a lot of people going, if they have access to a beach, going to find large stones to write on and assemble in their desks. You've given us a wonderful visual of what that might look like. What's next for you, Owen?
I like coaching. That I found my calling, I suppose. I love. Very privileged when people invite you into an environment. That's incredible buzz when people do that. it's an amazing thing when people are genuinely interested in what you're seeing and any ideas you have. And then when you find the right environment and the right leaders, you work together and you see a team become more competitive and perform better and basically realize that vision it's set for itself. So I couldn't enjoy my work more. I hope I can stay fit and healthy and do it for many more decades. That's all I want.
Brilliant. Well, look, I wish you the very best of health to do that, and continued good luck in everything you're doing. It's a wonderful book. We'll put a link to it in the show notes. If people want to reach you, Owen, find out a little bit more about you and your work, where best to find you?
Now, best for me is on LinkedIn, actually. I'm on Twitter as well, but LinkedIn I sort of have a good look at each day, and I occasionally post things, and most people who communicate with me do it through there.
Brilliant. Well, Owen, look, thank you once again for sharing your time with me on ScaleX Insider. It's been a real privilege to speak with you today. Thank you.
Brilliant to chat with you, and awesome questions. Appreciate it.